Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Ashley Annington, and I am a program officer here at ACYPL. I'm usually preparing groups for international travel or traveling around the United States with international groups. But while that's not possible right now, I am so excited to moderate today's town hall on another passion of mine, education. Today's town hall is the second in a three-part series focused on the American education system and the impact and response to COVID-19. Last week, our panelists discussed the inequities that exist within their districts and how these issues have been highlighted because of COVID-19. Today, we will pivot and look at where schools find themselves by discussing the pros and cons of distance learning, how teachers and students are being assessed during this highly unorthodox year, and finally, we'll examine the budgetary concerns that schools are facing for the upcoming school year. I'm so grateful to have three amazing ACYPL alum with us to share their experiences and expertise. Our first panelist is Chelsea King, who serves as the vice chair on the Westland-Wilsonville, Oregon School Board, and she traveled to Brazil in 2017. Next, we have Miguel Solis, who is a member of the Dallas School Board in Texas and traveled with ACYPL to Hungary and Croatia in 2019. And finally, we have Stephanie Summers, president of the David City Board of Education in Nebraska, who traveled to China in 2019 as well. Welcome, everyone. So first, we're going to get started with introductions. Chelsea, do you want to get started first?
Yes, thank you, Ashley, for coordinating us and for everybody at ACYPL who brought us together to have this conversation. I appreciate the opportunity. As Ashley mentioned, I'm Chelsea King, the Vice Chair of the Westland-Wilsonville School District School Board, and I have three children in our school district. I have a son going into his sophomore year at our public high school, one of our three public high schools, and I have boy-girl twins going into 8th grade in our Spanish immersion program at one of our middle schools. And when I'm not hanging out with my kids or volunteering on the school board, I do work as an organizational development consultant in my own private practice called Heart-Centered Work. And I did spend a little over 10 years in the college classroom as a college instructor.
Hi, everyone. My name is Miguel Solis, and I am a member of the Dallas Independent School District Board of Trustees. I am a 7-year school board member. Previously, I was a teacher in the Dallas ISD as an 8th grade middle school teacher, and then later would go on to become a central administrator in DISD as well. For my actual day job, I'm the executive director of the Coalition for a New Dallas, which is a policy think tank focused on transportation, housing, and education policy. And I am thrilled to be joining you all today in what I know is an interesting topic and one that I think is going to be ripe with lots of conversation. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Stephanie Summers. I traveled to China in 2019 with ACYPL, as Ashley stated, and I'm very grateful to them for inviting me to this second module of a three-part series. I am in my 10th year serving on the David City Board of Education, and I have three children in our district. I have a soon-to-be sophomore, soon-to-be 5th grader, and a soon-to-be kindergartner. And I am a teacher. I have a bachelor's and master's in math education, and I have taught at the community college level here in our state. So thanks again for inviting me to be a part of the conversation.
Thank you all. So first I wanted to let the audience know what districts you represent. Can you tell us a bit more about your school boards and your districts? Chelsea?
Absolutely. So I'm one of 5 school board members for the Westland-Wilsonville School District. And I believe we have a slide that's going to go up that will show a little bit about the geography of where we're located. You can see the map of Oregon there with a little arrow. We're just south of the Portland metro area. So Westland, Wilsonville, 2 different cities, 1 school district. You'll see there we have just shy of 10,000 students and 9 primary schools 4 middle schools and 3 high schools. That includes 1 charter school. I'd say a couple of notable features about our district are, one is our high graduation rate. As you'll see, we have a, let's move my box so I can see the numbers correctly. We have a nearly 95% overall graduation rate. And notably, we do have the goal of by the year 2025 to make that 100% of our students graduating. We're commonly ranked fairly high in the state of Oregon with those bodies like niche.com or US News and World Report that ranks our schools. And what that means for our school district is we also have very high expectations. So along with that high achievement, we have high expectations of our administrators and teachers, and our families have high expectations of their school board members and their students as well. So those are some notable features of our culture here. And then 2 programs that we run in our schools that I think are worth mentioning is that we do have all-inclusive classrooms. So we have, for our special education students, we do not have any separate special education classrooms. All of our students attend the mainstream classroom. And also we do have a Spanish immersion track, so a dual language program, and that's relatively new. The past 8 years in our school district, and it's very popular.
Okay. Thank you. Miguel?
Yeah, if you could click to the next slide. So the Dallas ISD is the 2nd largest school system in the state of Texas. We have roughly 154,000 students. A super majority of our kids are qualify as Latinx. 21% of our students are African American, and then 9% represent other races. One interesting nugget of information is also that of the 154,000 kids, nearly 45% of those kids are English language learners, which is the highest concentration of English language learners, not just in the state of Texas, but it's the highest concentration of English language learners in the United States, which has been something that has been a growing number over the years, and is also factored into our thinking around digital learning in the age of COVID. 91% of our students qualify for federal free or reduced lunch, which is essentially below the poverty line. We have 23,000 staff members, and we've got nearly a $2 billion budget. Additional context that I want to provide you all, because we'll delve into this a lot more in just a bit. Of our 154,000 kids post-COVID lockdown, we have been able to regain contact with over 99.3% of our students. That has been a huge effort, and it has involved every type of staff member that you could possibly imagine, including our own internal security and police department as well, which have essentially dropped their traditional jobs and turned into educators and community liaisons. 2 additional things I want you to know. From a technological deployment standpoint, basically making sure that kids can have distance learning, we have had to deploy over 100,000 individual technological units, whether that's a Google Chromebook or a hotspot or other devices. And additionally, of all of those, we've had to distribute about 33, 34, 35, around there. We're still trying to get the total numbers, but 33, 34, 35 hotspots across the district. So that's, roughly 35,000 of our students who don't have access to the Wi-Fi necessary, or at least didn't until we got these hotspots delivered. Additionally, our children rely on our school system for food, essentially breakfast, lunch, and sometimes dinner. So over the past few months, we've served over 6.4 million meals in ensuring that our kids and their families can have access to healthy food. So I wanted to provide those additional statistics simply because I think it's going to be relevant to the future of the future discussion. So thank you, and I'll turn it over to Stephanie now.
Thanks, Miguel. I'm located in significantly smaller part or more rural part of the country than Miguel is. David City, Nebraska has a population of less than 3,000 people. Right now we're about, I think maybe like 2,600. I think we might have reached a high of 2,900 at one point a couple years ago. But the median household income for our community is a little over $50,000. Our community has 2 separate school districts, and we each have a student enrollment of roughly the same size. David City Public Schools that I serve on is 630 students. 46% of those students are considered economically disadvantaged. So very similar to what Miguel was talking about, they qualify for the free and reduced lunch prices or free and reduced preschool tuition that we offer for our students. Also, we have our 21% special education students. We have a lot of other different other percentages of diversity in our school as well, but I thought that those 2 specific statistics spoke more to what we're talking about today with the distance learning and the challenges that we saw as a district here in Nebraska. One of the other things that I wanted to point out, just so that we can understand, just the geography of Nebraska in general, rural Nebraska can be very different than rural New York or rural, even rural Wyoming. Wyoming is very rural, but we have very different areas of the state. So our eastern part of the state is where I'm located, and we're actually one of the more populated areas. And so even with us being on the eastern side, we still have 25 miles that separate our community, to another community that might be 6,000 people or 10,000 people. And those are, the next largest communities. And we have to drive about 45 minutes to get to any real urban area. So that would be Lincoln or Omaha. Maybe you might be familiar with those communities. And in between, when you're driving those miles, it's nothing but cornfields and wheat fields and bean fields. And so I point that out because the infrastructure needed to give quality online learning and distance education for our kids during the COVID closure is just a little bit more difficult, because not only do you have the affordability problem for a lot of our students, but the infrastructure just isn't even there too. So I just want to, rural can mean a lot of different things depending on where you are located in the country, but we here in David City, as well as places across the state, a lot more rural than what we are, have dealt with just the lack of infrastructure to be able to provide those services. So that's a little bit about our district, and we'll move on to the conversation.
Well, thank you, Stephanie. I'm really excited to hear about such a diverse group of communities. So first, I want to turn it over to Stephanie, and let's draw our attention to where we are now. So how prepared were your students and parents and your teachers to transition to distance learning? I know you all mentioned the lack of technology and some of the solutions your districts implemented. Can you speak more to what kind of programs or assistance you were able to provide to your community members? Stephanie?
Sure. So I have a slide that kind of lets everybody know where David City Public Schools was when we began our initiative. When we began the closure. Back in 2010, 2011, we had actually launched a one-to-one technology initiative that allowed us to provide laptops to our 9 through 12 students at the beginning. So every student was assigned a laptop that was used in the classroom and at home. And then 2 years later, we added our 7th and 8th grade students to the mix. So we have been a one-to-one district for quite a few years now. Throughout the last decade, we added grades 3 through 6 are given Chromebooks as well. However, those Chromebooks don't go home with the students. So during normal school time, they stay at the school in carts, but are used in the classroom. And then our kindergarten through 2nd graders get to use laptops, which is a little bit more kid-friendly, more appropriate for their age level. In addition, one of the things I want to point out, so what we found out through some of our surveys, through the parents and staff members, was that we had 5% of our students that had zero access to internet at home. That's not counting spotty internet access, right? So the rural broadband issues were not only a struggle for students, but also for teachers. You have multiple students in a home and the parent working from home. And so broadband, I think sometimes no matter where you live, is going to support 3 to 5 people all working at the same time online, especially when it comes to videos, Zoom meetings, and the like. So I guess for Davis City Public Schools, our kids in our district were in a good position to translate everything to an online or a distance learning platform because we had the devices. But having the devices in a kid's hand doesn't necessarily mean success is going to happen when you actually have them sent home. And what we found was that over the last decade, we had been doing incremental professional development with our staff on using technology and instructional strategies. And the COVID closure kind of brought to light some of the things that we still need to make sure that we do as a district and a staff to make sure that we're fully invested in our one-to-one technology initiative. We had kind of gone by the wayside and had focused on other professional development opportunities for our teachers, which were all valid and very much appreciated and useful in the classroom. But then when we all of a sudden get, cast into this world where we now have to teach from online, then we found ourselves lacking in that area. So I guess our students were a little bit more prepared, and our teachers, while they had some experience, we had a lot to learn in that area. Other than that, I will go ahead and pass it on to our other panelists too to talk about their districts.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, I want to open this up to make this a conversation and a dialogue. With Stephanie having such a small community, granted 3,000 students is still a lot of students, but how does that look in a more urban area in Dallas? Because you said that 30,000 students didn't have the connectivity. So you handed out hotspots, but what does that look like with iPads or laptops? Did they have that sort of accessibility as well? Or was Dallas required to provide that resource?
Yeah, I don't think it would be too surprising to people, especially those that may already be in the education field, that there isn't much difference between what happened in Stephanie's district and what happened in mine. It's simply the scale. We actually had been preparing for some time to try to move to more technology being used by our children. So the ability to be able to take the Google Chromebooks that we purchased for essentially every child that didn't leave the classroom and just simply allow the students to take the laptops home was a simple decision. From a hotspot standpoint, we'd actually already had about 10,000 hotspots purchased that students had been using. And so it was just making the budgetary decision to allocate additional monies to deploy more hotspots. As I think about the logistical side of where we prepared, I think, my answer is yes, for the most part. From a pedagogical standpoint, were we prepared to support our educators? Were our educators prepared to be able to go to a pure digital format? Sadly, the answer is we weren't prepared. And I'm not quite sure that we would have ever been prepared, because this is a once in a lifetime pandemic. The last time we saw something the scales of this would have been 1918. But I will also say that there had been elements of instructional innovation that had been manifesting in certain schools in DISD, things like personalized learning, which is essentially taking the 23-to-1 scenario where you have one teacher for every 23 students and paring it down to more of a one-to-one approach utilizing technology. We have schools like that in DISD. And so you can imagine we immediately went to those principals and that department to try to understand how can we train all of our teachers in a short time to better prepare themselves for the jump to digital learning. Additionally, we've been partnering with Apple to pilot a hybrid school model where half of the time students would be in school and the other half of the time they'd actually be doing digital learning. So, it was almost a prescient decision a few years ago to engage in this MOU with Apple. And now it's almost as if this is a no-brainer that we should not just do this one school that way, but potentially see if there might be other ways to do it across other schools as well. So that's where we are right now. Pedagogically, we're still trying to figure out what was the experience of our educators. We've got surveys out, we're gathering data, and we're also taking the feedback that we got from people like instructional coaches, assistant principals, and principals to better understand how we can improve in the next few months. But Ashley, I would say it's been a very similar experience to what Stephanie said, and probably likely what Chelsea will say as well.
Yeah, it's just really interesting because COVID appeared in a time in our lives where we're leaning more towards technology. So I'm not that much older than the high school student, I think. And so when right. So when I was in high school, we also had the laptops that we could take home. They look nothing like the laptops that students have access to now. But it's really interesting that this time in technology is when COVID has appeared in our lives. And now we're able to begin that transition that a lot of school districts were already starting with the hybrid and kind of pushing that those programs so that students have full access. Chelsea, what are your experiences, or are any challenges and gifts or pros and cons that you'd like to share?
Yes, I agree totally with what Miguel was saying about scalability. Similar to what Stephanie was saying, we were aiming for one-to-one. We had, in some ways, a one-to-one with technology with Chromebooks to students, but we did have a percentage of students who didn't have that technology and who didn't have access to reliable Wi-Fi. And so we did we distributed 3,400 Chromebooks and about 50 hotspots. So the number, perhaps in proportion to the fact we have 9,800 students, it's a significant percentage of our students who we distributed Chromebooks to. The logistics were amazing to watch because you can't just go knock on someone's door and hand them a Chromebook. We had to distribute Chromebooks during a pandemic. And so the protocols that were placed over the top of the distribution of the technology was really remarkable. As far as our preparedness, one of the things that was really fascinating to reflect on was the number of pivots that we had to make.
Chelsea, are you there? Okay. Well, we're going to come back to Chelsea when she reconnects with us, because I'm really interested to see how because I know she was talking about a hybrid program and the pivoting. Like, I know it's very easy just like to knock on doors like Girl Scout cookies and hand out things or ask people to sign petitions, but it is very different when you now have to make sure that people are safe, not only your employees who are handing out these materials, but also the students and families who are coming along, and that way they're not intermingling and passing along the virus.
Ashley, I was thinking of one other thing while we wait for Chelsea to come back, is that I think one of the other struggles too is that not every piece of your curriculum is going to transfer to an online platform. So we like to, where the world is wanting to focus on career readiness, not just college readiness. And a lot of those hands-on courses that speak to those kids, and especially for us where we live in such an agricultural area and we live in a very blue-collar community where there's a lot of interest in the technical trades and in the arts and those types of things, that trying to learn how to translate that into an online platform is going to be very difficult, and something that we definitely struggled with during the COVID closure.
And I would add too, Stephanie, this may come up in discussion just a little bit, but this it's really personal for me. So I didn't mention this at the beginning, I have a 2-year-old, Olivia, and She's not in school right now, but right after she was born, she essentially had to have a heart transplant. And so her immune system is significantly compromised. And so all of the therapies that she goes through, she has physical therapy, she has speech therapy, she has occupational therapy. All of that now is having to be done through telemedicine. So now imagine being the parent of a student who qualifies as special education. And if you think about that, I mean, it's a very nuanced definition, right? Because you can be special education ranging from, having dyslexia all the way to literally needing your hands massaged or, to help you with your learning. And so that was the thing that I think of all of the things that we weren't prepared for. Mm-hmm. That was the most that we weren't prepared because of how physical you have to be in many cases and how, esoteric the educational experience is for students that have got these individualized education programs. So that's another thing that we've got to get right, and we're trying to figure it out, but there's so many barriers in place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Hi, Chelsea. Yeah, I think the fact that this internet connection is an issue is really indicative of some of the issues that students have. Like, I am terrible with technology, so if my internet goes off, I'm immediately calling my provider, or I've just given up for the day. And so how are teachers now keeping students engaged? How are they kind of, like you said, translating those lesson plans that were fully in person now to completely online? Like, how are teachers and even parents making sure that their students are being accountable and checking in and doing the assignments?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. The irony was not lost on me that I was being kicked off of the internet the second time this morning. And, we're asking our students to persevere with those types of technological challenges. And forgive me if I'm a little offbeat with the conversation. I did lose a few minutes here. But, one of the things that was coming up for me too around this, bringing our pedagogy online is, and the ask to do it very quickly, were some of the challenges with things like Zoom or video technology. We had security issues in Oregon, where there was a public school in rural Southern Oregon where the teacher was giving a class and they were like, is it called Zoom bombed or something, where someone came in and displayed a bunch of inappropriate images in the classroom, and the students and the teacher, of course, saw it before they could exit. And so being slow and careful with how we approach using new technologies, asking students to film themselves and upload it for the whole class to view, or, get onto a video conferencing where you can see my home and hear what's going on in my home. It poses a whole set of unique challenges that we don't have when our students are coming into our schools. Mm-hmm. And so in my district, we have high expectations. Many of our families expected us to be able to make that pivot very quickly. But when you want to move cautiously and carefully, those things take time. You have to put structure and policies in place.
And, the other part of that engagement piece that we found for our students in our community, especially like obviously in our secondary, the secondary school, is engaging students who their parents were let go, so they're picking up extra hours at their part-time job just so that they can help make ends meet. Or they're going to take extra hours at the grocery store so that their coworker who's elderly doesn't have to take their position and be exposed. And so, wanting those students to still be engaged in their academic learning, but having all of these life situations happening around them, it's a big ask. And it's something that you always want to be mindful of when you're doing online learning, distance learning, and something that will definitely be considered as we move on into the next school year too, is just where are our kids when they're outside of the school building. And during the closure, it was all the time, and they were having to make some very adult choices in their lives that we weren't always privy to in the moment.
Miguel?
I mean, we had a discussion about this last discussion, so I won't go into it too deep, but there were also sort of these hidden these hidden discoveries or these discoveries of hidden inequities that also manifest things like what may have been causing a child to be disruptive in a classroom when they were in school. Like there's been a correlation between the closing of schools and the increase of child abuse cases in Dallas. There's been an increase of domestic violence cases in Dallas. And so like from a pedagogical standpoint, trying to figure out how do you provide wraparound services to students who you had access to for 7 or 8 hours a day to now having no access to, and the inability perhaps of a child to be able to express to you what they would have expressed to you while they were in school, because it's not a safe space to do. Like there are just these other things that have come up when I think about what we traditionally are able to accomplish in a school that you're no longer able to do whenever you can't physically be there with a kid and they're not in that safe, welcoming space. So just additionally, something I wanted to add.
So as we're rethinking engagement, we're also having to rethink assessments. So how are assessments or standardized tests being proctored on the state and federal level? Because I know many schools, districts, or states receive federal funding based on the growth that's being measured in their students through these tests. So how are you all being able to distribute those, or are you distributing those exams?
Yeah, I'll jump in here first. It's such a great question, and I'm sure Stephanie and Miguel would agree that assessments is a big question. It's one that goes beyond just the state or federal mandated tests. The answer for, were we able to administer things like Smarter Balance, which measures the Common Core standards, or our MAP, which measures our own standards in our school district. No, we didn't administer those standardized tests, but we definitely relied on other forms of assessment. And this, as far as like this frame that we're working with the gifts and challenges of COVID-19, one of the things that came up in our district wasn't so much about the PSAT or the Smarter Balance or the MAP. What came up as a really relevant topic in the state of Oregon, and particularly in my district, was grading. Are our students going to get a letter grade? Mm-hmm. And in fact, there was an entire petition that went all the way up to the state level, to the Oregon Department of Education, asking to assign grades. And we had a whole coalition of organizations who are focused on closing opportunity gaps and achievement gaps between different demographics of our students. They organized and said, no, assigning a grade right now is not going to actually measure a student's academic abilities. It's going to measure other factors in their life. And so it's an equity issue not to assign a grade. So that's raised a larger question in our district as we think about going back to school in the fall. And we're going to probably get back into grading. And so what does a letter grade, A, B, C, D, F, what does it actually measure? Are we measuring the fact that students are reaching standards that we say they're going to reach, that they're going to learn those things? Or are we, grading something else? So pedagogically, it's requiring our teachers to really think about assignments that they're creating, rubrics for grading them, and why are they giving the assignment, and grading it as such, so that we can ensure that that type of assessment is really accurate in measuring student learning. So that's one of the things that's really coming up around assessments, as well as the importance of the interim assessment. So those standardized tests that we administer at the end of the year are summative. They're one point in time. Mm-hmm. But pedagogically, solid instruction is measuring student achievement at many periods of time throughout the course. And I'll say one more thing, and then I'll yield the floor. But that is this idea of the learning gap as well. How are we going to measure where students are when they come back in the fall? Are we going to go back and start teaching to standards from 6 or 8 months ago And what will that do to our achievement gap or our achievement progression? And we don't want to do that in Westland Wilsonville. We want to start teaching right at that grade level with those standards where they're supposed to be when we start in the fall. But that's going to require quite a bit of assessment to measure where is that student, which students are able to just pick right up and which students will need additional support to get caught up. So assessment, in my opinion, is a much more nuanced and complex discussion than standardized tests that has, federal or state funding linked to it.
Yeah, and I agree with Chelsea. We were not required to complete our state assessments or the NSCAS. That was waived for us. We normally will do that in March, April, May kind of general area. It's summative. What did you learn at the end of the year? And but we also do the MAP testing, and we complete those 3 times a year. Here in David City, we give a fall, a winter, and a spring score. So those winter scores will be very helpful for our placement of students in the fall. But more importantly, it's going to be the teachers and the way that they felt the kids were working with them in their online learning. So for us, when we were grading through online, it was very important that we had, we knew we would be grading parental support. You knew you would be grading time or connectivity even is what you're grading. So we allowed so much flexibility in our grading process. It was more about, did the student learn the material that you wanted them to learn, and giving them an opportunity for resubmissions. There wasn't any penalty necessarily. It was more of, this is the information we want you to learn, and if you meet this specific expectation that we think that you fulfilled your requirement, then we're going to give you credit for that. But you can't punish kids for a situation that they're not able to control either. So I think that's just, but one thing that it did was, grading was already kind of an issue, not an issue in a bad way, but it was something that had already been discussed in our school district prior to COVID. And so COVID itself just kind of brought it to the forefront and focused a little bit more and allowed the teachers and the administrators to have a little bit more of a conversation. And there will be more conversation when we come back in the fall of exactly what Chelsea said. So that's kind of a gift, is that, things that we were kind of already thinking about in the back, it just pushes it up to the front. And it allows us to have a more meaningful conversation, because you can see the ramifications of it with the system that you had before.
We also had our state test, the STAR exam, suspended, and I'm sure that this is the same for Stephanie and Chelsea. The period of time where we went into lockdown in Dallas County, because we didn't have a statewide lockdown. Our governor ultimately never ended up taking that dramatic of a step, but we did have, for a period of time, the entire state under certain mitigation tactics. But in Dallas County, we actually went pretty far. And so I remember it's towards the tail end of March is whenever we shut everything down. And it just so happens that in the academic calendar, at that point, you were actually giving these standardized tests. And then it's sort of this, it's like a well-known secret that after the state exams, you just sort of like, you coast a little bit. Maybe you have your district end of year exam if you're going to have those. But I'll tell you, it was because it happened at this time, it was really interesting to get it to see how teachers were going to react, because essentially it's on you. Like, this is the first time in some time where you never actually had sort of the Damoclean sword of assessment and accountability hanging over you for the last couple of months of your teaching experience. So again, we don't have all of the data gathered yet on the full experience of distance learning for educators and the notion of assessment. But my gut tells me that I think teachers to a degree will have appreciated the autonomy that not having the assessment provided them to just try to do the best job that they could possibly do with the materials that they had for their students. But I think the other thing is like, and we'll get to this, I think, in a little bit, the idea of how do you, assessment is used to be able to try to a degree, gauge the effectiveness of education classroom by classroom. There's clearly a philosophical debate about whether that should be the case or not, but right now, that's generally how assessments are used. And so figuring out what the future conversation around assessment and accountability is going to look like in districts, I think is going to be significantly influenced by these past couple of months and what the first few months will look like when districts start going back to school, likely in August.
If I may, can I piggyback on that for a
Oh,
second?
of course.
Okay, because listening to Miguel reminded me of sort of a new data point that we have in our district now, that we moved everything online. And so when we look at things like measuring student engagement and how much creativity and responsibility do teachers have in the classroom, we now have an entirely new set of data to explore that. So, an administrator can get in and see at any given time. And when you talk about deprivatizing the classroom, which I don't know if that's part of your discussion with any of you, in some ways, moving it online has entirely deprivatized the classroom, because any administrator at any point can see the teacher, how much time they were given in any lesson, the level of student engagement, did students click on things or not, did they watch the video to the end or not, did they submit assignments, which students are submitting and to what degree. I mean, there's a lot of new information. So when we look at measuring instructor engagement and student engagement, we have new information to ask, what's working, what's not working, for whom is it working, and how can we fix it?
That's a really interesting point, Chelsea. It's honestly something that I've up until this point never thought about. This notion of, I remember there were a few years back under our previous superintendent, he came up with a rule that he implemented district-wide that teachers must keep their doors open, so that way their instructional coaches or evaluators could get in and out, and there was this transparency that I think was infused in the decision, and there was significant pushback, and I can understand some of that pushback. But with this, the amount of data that you can accumulate on students' experiences, the ability to pop in and out, I do think that is something that's not talked about enough right now, but is a potentially revolutionary concept.
Well, and I think that, that is a complete kind of societal change on how we view education and how we deliver education, right? I mean, it's always been, oh, you took an online class, or it's always just been kind of here and there. But I think it will be a significant shift in thinking for people going into education as well, that you might not have your own classroom, that this isn't what it might look like, that it might be completely different, or there'll be different expectations on how you use technology in your classroom that can also be used when students are not in the classroom, right? And I think that it speaks to, at least as a board member, how am I going to support the teachers and the administration in delivering the kind of professional development they're going to need? Because you don't want to have an entire, your entire district feel at a loss for this new way of doing things that you might have to do just because of COVID. But also, I think it's a really exciting way to look at what education could be too. But you just don't want to lose sight of the fact that you have some teachers that are very, that are just going to struggle with the technology aspect of it. And also, like I was saying before, that there's just certain curriculums that don't lend themselves well to that. And so how do you build that into the system too? So I think this whole process is the ability to move the entire system to another level. That's just really exciting to think about.
And as you change assessments and engagement, I think we also have to think about how are we changing funding. So I know Miguel discussed how they had to provide more technology to students so that money had to come into, support that mission to give the technology to the students. But then how are we now assessing teachers in a merit-based system? Or what do budgets look like for the next school year? What are you now concentrating more on? So you may spend less on physical textbooks and more on online programs, or more on new data or new to measure, and less on, say, I don't know, fixing up a school and maintaining the structure. So what are budgets looking like for this next up and coming school year?
Yeah, so, you know, I let me start by sort of describing from a human capital standpoint budgetary considerations that we're having to deal with in DISD right now. So we are a very unique school district in that most school systems, and again, I can't speak for Stephanie's or Chelsea's, we haven't had this conversation, but most school systems use a step scale pay system for their educators. And so, every year or every other year, provided you remain in the system, you are going to get an increase in your salary. Back in 2015, I want to say, we made a significant shift in DISD to go to a full merit-based pay system. And essentially, the merit system is it's driven by a new evaluation system that incorporates stuff like student experience, surveys from students and how they feel about their classroom and their teachers, quantitative data, including assessments, and then qualitative pedagogical data, people being in your classroom and evaluating you and then coaching you to do additional things so that you can improve your growth and so on and so forth. So this really esoteric evaluation system fuels the merit-based pay system. And it has been, as you could assume, it was very controversial early on, but it's become sort of the norm now that it's been baked into the system, and teachers, are making up to 90, if not now over $90,000, provided they're getting results for kids. But when you put a pause on testing, then you have an issue with the data that you are able to and not able to accumulate to fund the merit system. So we had to put a pause on that and hold our teachers harmless when we think about distributing funds for their salaries this year. Next year is going to be an even more interesting time because some of these data are staggered. And so you may be an educator in this system that may have been thinking you were going to get a raise because you were going to likely get into the next category based on the improvement of your students. And now you're not going to get that because we don't have those data that we would have had from the previous school year. So we're having to get really strategic around, what we do in the meantime. But, moving forward, some of those monies was also going to come from the budget from the state. And in 2008, after the real estate crisis and the financial crisis, our state cut $5.4 billion from the state's education budget. This previous year, we had, first in 20 years, revolutionary school finance reform, which plugged monies in that we were going to be able to pull from to continue expanding the merit-based pay system. And it's likely that that's not going to exist moving forward, or if it is, it may not exist to the amount that we thought it was going to. So major budget crisis that's going to come up in Texas, and we're going to have to think through it.
Stephanie, what does it look like in Nebraska?
I think we're similar to probably every other state in the union. Nebraska is going to have a definite budget shortfall, and public education is a large portion of that general fund that they draw from. And so there's going to be significant cuts especially in a lot of the urban areas. The way that our state funds our education system might be a little bit different from Miguel and Chelsea's, I'm not sure. Davis City Public Schools does not receive really much of any state funding. All of our, probably I'm not going to say a percentage, but we are what's considered a non-equalized school district. So we get a very little bit amount of state funding, and so the budget shortfall there in the state might not affect us so much, but what does affect us is our property taxpayers' ability to pay their property taxes. And so that's where we are going to see some definite concerns when it comes to what programs we are offering. We're talking about purchasing possibly some hotspots if we have to go into a closure again. And are we going to be able to do that? Are we going to be able to expand some of the programs that we've been looking at, especially in our career and technical sciences or full day preschool? So I think while we don't receive a lot of money directly from the state, it's going to affect it affects our farmers, it affects our ranchers, and that in itself will definitely affect our school and the decisions that we have to make for our budgets for next year, which, we're already talking about, and we'll have to be making decisions shortly, not to mention some of the other things that we'll have to purchase for next school year, just so that we can abide by some of the CDC or our own state guidelines to be able to hold school.
Yeah, similar to what Miguel was saying, we recently in Oregon passed what we called once in a lifetime legislation called the Student Success Act. And it created, actually it put a 1.7% tax on gross sales receipt, which is kind of a big deal in Oregon because we don't have sales tax. So it placed this tax on gross sales on businesses and was going to generate, billions of dollars. So hire mental health professionals, invest in early childhood education, invest in career and technical education. And we have been told not to expect money from that fund. Simultaneously, we're in the second year of a biennium, and we were told to cut 17% of our budget, which means 17% of an entire year's budget. So we just approved our budget. It is a cuts budget. We approved cutting something like 16 FTE, that's the full-time equivalency. We're cutting principals' budgets. We did cut our preschool program. And we're doing this while simultaneously increasing costs for busing, reducing class sizes to accommodate for, social distancing when we return to school. So it's a very complicated time. In Oregon, our legislators are currently in a short session. We are hoping that they tap into something called the Rainy Day Fund to release some monies that we have saved to help out our local school districts. But I know we're getting close to time, but I'll just say one thing about the unique nature of Westland-Wilsonville is that our voters did just pass two things. One is the local option levy, which puts additional property taxes on our district that pays for additional teachers. So we basically retained about 80 full-time equivalency teachers. And then we also passed the capital bond, $206 million, of which we've already started to spend on investing in the infrastructure of our schools as well as our technological infrastructure. And lastly, it does raise a very interesting question. When we think about designing new schools and building, we're going to build a new middle school, what is it going to look like? How will the potential of doing, more hybrid and distance learning affect the physical layout of, the buildings that we design? And that's a fascinating question I hope to be able to explore more comprehensively with my community.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because when I think of, say, a preschool, what does recess look like now? What does PE look like? Or for younger children who have teachers that are a little less traditional and having students sit at a desk and maybe sit on a communal carpet or just like have that area where you can play. Now, what does that look like for students? And then when it comes to budget, so a lot of teachers share materials. And so now are you going to have extra hand sanitizers or extra wipes? Do you have to get more markers? Do students have to purchase their own individual cases of crayons? And I think, yeah, budget conversation is going to be very important. I mean, as always, because we have to fund everything. But yeah, those intricacies, because it's just things that you don't think of that now we share. And how do you keep 4-year-olds who haven't seen each other in months away from each other in the classroom? So I think as we go forward in our next conversation to talk about, okay, what now? We're approaching a new school year. What does that now look like? And I think that's going to be a very fascinating conversation, whether schools decide to do a hybrid program where you do some days on and some days off. Are you fully going back to school, or are you staying home? I think that'll be our cliffhanger for our next town hall. I really want to thank all 3 of you for joining us. I think these are great conversations for our audience to hear. So again, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to join us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. I'll see you next time.
See you next time.